Hey folks, we're doing something a bit different, a bit new today, if only because, well, while I am making a side channel, Crit Bits, in order to dive deep into my backlog and actually dent the damn thing, I couldn't help but find myself overwhelmed with thoughts. I had things I wanted to say, but trying to do that for everything would just loop right back into that whole I will never make a meaningful impact on my backlog, or even my personal gaming. It's a thing, but that's only if I maintain the same formula as before. So, welcome to Crit Bits Crunch Time, where I'll be talking about titles I've delved into for the Crit Bits channel, albeit a bit more casually than the norm. Well, that, and also for any games that the audio may have self-destructed from, or any games that I got wrangled into by friends. In any case, let's get this show on the road. And yeah, no, I have to be honest here, a lot of games have been on my wish list untouched for years. And Arcade Distillery's Plague Road is among those. I snagged it during a Steam sale, and it just perpetually sat there. And that might have been for the best, as it turns out. See, Plague Road is a roguelite, which is normally the sort of thing I just gravitate towards. I like a game that can provide me with a crunchy gameplay loop, and that bit of randomization to keep me hooked so things don't get repetitive. Or rather, that's a distinct appeal the genre generally carries, which Plague Road missed the memo on, because my god, is it tedious. Think lengthy, narrow corridors full of enemies that are slightly faster than you, so outrunning them is an issue. And I did want to outrun them, because whenever I failed to do so, I was dragged into an, air quote, strategic turn-based battle. Or, well, what passes for one. Like, I won't sit here and say fighting is the worst, but there is a very limited array of enemies to fight, and they all have exactly one ability to their name, which makes combat very bland. Like, sure, you can technically squeeze some joy out of trying to build a strategically sound composition of characters who can make a sustainable front line. See, packing an excess of healers into a squad. But, well, there's definitely times where a fight will start, and you'll have a healer randomly flanked by a trio of heavy hitters who take turns slapping them before you get a turn. Which, I should note, will feel like watching a train wreck in slow motion because the developers really don't want you skipping any attack animations, whether it belongs to the enemy or yourself. Which gets bad when you have 5 units on your side and 5 on theirs. And also, it's not just that you can't skip it, you can't even speed it up. Oh, and even worse, when you find out that enemies can initiate new fights with you while you're still on a victory screen, so you can wind up in 2 or even 3 unavoidable battles back to back because you failed to slip by some tightly packed enemies. And it's not like getting into fights is even rewarding. Like, yes, you technically get a catch-all alchemical currency for killing enemies. Here's the thing, while I did need 50 of these to unlock the second area permanently, I was tripping over these from all of those just unavoidable fights that you can't run from, to the point that I had more than 5 times the amount I needed for the next room, which cost even more. And it's not like you can really spend them on anything otherwise. Not that I'm a super huge fan of the whole sit in this area and grind until you can pass go in the first place. But yeah, okay, there is a crafting system, sort of, where you can make healing potions or stamina potions in exchange for that same currency. But, well, not only are they dirt cheap, you can only hold a limited amount, so it's not really a resource dump, especially since the random chests you encounter only hold potions, meaning your camp stock quickly becomes overstocked. The biggest reward, honestly, that you can find during your runs are the survivors scattered about the map, who you need to walk to and rescue, and who lock you in place with dialogue so enemies can ambush you. By the way, it's the exact same dialogue every time, so that's cool. Thankfully, they are a resource that isn't lost when you die. In fact, you only lose the party members you're running with when you do die, which is especially bad when the Plague Doctor dies, since the fight automatically ends. Anyways, survivors. Yeah, they're useful. They become new party members in town whose strength, class, and abilities are random, and which I nefariously slaughtered for the most part and fed to my town buildings, all in the name of permanent progression. Nothing says efficiency like having more health and stamina for the doctor, a higher potion cap, and the ability to expand and customize the kits of all future characters that I am going to be stuffing into this meat grinder because meta progression. Okay, I mean, actually, nothing beats that except for, oh, I don't know, skipping those battle animations because I'm still not over that. Still, having laid this out, this really does outline the bulk of the gameplay loop. Essentially, you run through corridors, avoiding fights to the best of your ability, snag as many survivors as you can, and then feed all the bad ones to buff progression and keep the good ones so the next run is smoother, and to potentially fulfill the sparse requests you'll wind up getting from the NPCs you'll find at the start and end of each area. Such as bringing 2 nurses to a location, which in tandem with the survivor cap of 20, means you'll be mulching a lot of people in the hopes that RNG will finally give you what you need, which then in turn will unlock a new building in town. That one in specific being a nursery that lets you upgrade the nurses. It's something, not something great, and the story doesn't really provide anything to salvage this. The most notable thing I can think of at the moment is it has a narrator who you might recognize, but that's really about it. Like, so yeah, if I had to give this game a rating, it's a failure to respect my time, to create diverse and engaging combat, since that is the bulk of what you're going to be doing, and even to make use of its fundamental nature as a roguelite. Like, at its very core, my last couple hours would be defined by the gradual realization that every fight could be won by spamming freeze blasters on soldiers, because enemies could be perpetually frozen without fail every turn, indefinitely. That's it. That's all. Maybe have a healer to top up people while the turn slowly ticks around, since you can pull in quite a few people, but yeah, there's nothing else here. I put time into this game that I'm never getting back. Anyways, the next game on this list is definitely something different, being, and I hope I say this right, but I'm probably not, Ji Huan Mang's Beats and Boss, a rhythm-based action title with some rogue-inspired elements, which tasks the player with clearing waves of baddies to the beat. And honestly, it's pretty cute. In it, you take the role of a suitably belt-strapped protagonist who bumbles her way into a demonic city in the name of adventure, and inevitably meets her downfall. And by that I mean die, because it is all but inevitable. But it's fine, because there's a time loop going on for reasons, and a magical girl tier fuzzy animal to clue her into the shenanigans that are going on. So, you know, a cute premise, relatively, unless you've seen, you know, Madoka, but I swear it's not that. But yeah, no. The small bits of dialogue that play when you beat a boss the first time are also fun, but other than that, you really shouldn't go into expecting anything substantial, as the big reveal at the end boils down to, I hope you like looping playthroughs. If there is anything beyond that, I never did find it, and that's after I played enough to unlock everything and hit a New Game Plus 3 difficulty, which was miserable, I should note. But hey, since we're on the subject, let's talk gameplay, because Beats and Boss is simple, but neat. With an emphasis on simple here, given that the controls can be summed up as moving, really, albeit complicated by the fact that this is a turn-based title where the turn length matches the tempo of the beat. A beat that speeds up stage by stage no less, which alongside the numerous and assorted enemy waves, winds up providing Beats and Boss a frantic yet still tactical feel to the experience. Because sure, swinging at an enemy is as simple as facing them and being in range, but you'll need to be mindful of projectiles from the sides and ceiling alongside enemies trying to flank you. And while you can consecutively dodge by default, the stamina bar recharges fairly slowly, more or less forcing players to pay attention to when an enemy is gearing up to swing or getting close to flanking you, since preemptive action can also lead to you getting caught out. or unable to use your ranged attacks since they'll only trigger when there's adequate space between you and an enemy, and those wind up being more important at the end of the day since there's some really good options that can clear a floor or just wipe out a shielded enemy. And really, it's just good practice for bosses due to the sheer assortment of attacks being tossed your way, or needing to dodge through a wall of bullets if only she can bait a boss into dropping death somewhere less central. And you will need to do this since the bosses aren't targetable at the start of each fight, essentially forcing you to endure increasingly elaborate attack patterns the further you get in. At least until they deign to throw hands personally in the name of fighting fair. Or, well, fairish. The Caster Witch remains a cheap teleporting hussy whose projectile spam only gets worse with each rematch, which just plain feels bad. Especially once you take into account that you're not only soaking damage, you're also losing access to the combo system, which requires that you play flawlessly. See, provided you can chain enough kills without getting hit, it'll turn the stage into a disco floor of death, granting you access to the combo passives associated with your gear, which can be pretty stellar, honestly. Though keep in mind I said kills, so if you get nicked during a boss fight, you are SOL. I mean, special attacks can grant iframes for more leeway, but by default, those also charge through kills, so in most cases, you will get one shot during a fight if you didn't use it earlier on the stage, because sometimes you just need a floor-wide clear that heals on hit or a few seconds of invulnerability. Note though that this only applies by default, because Beats and Boss has a roguish run progression in the form of traits you can select whenever a boss dies, which, yeah, can provide some fairly useful options like crit chance, extra health, or dash power, but it also provides a lot more indirect advantages like a chance at gaining health or charge with every song beat, or sometimes when you land a crit, or maybe after dodging, or... Okay, yeah, the theme here is a lot of these are not only contextual, they are a contextual chance of something happening with initially low odds, which can feel pretty bad as an option early in the game and makes for a somewhat bland experience as you wind up needing to stack the same perk to get any real mileage out of them. Also, insultingly, the game will keep throwing capped upgrades at you, which can't be checked while at the perk selection screen, so it is very possible to accidentally pick one that you don't need anymore, though it becomes less of a concern if you clear a run in loop, since you'll start to get stacked perk-wise anyways. Nothing like being capped on health, regen, and do not lose combo on being hit. In any case though, that isn't the whole of the progression, because there is also a meta system based around the gems that enemies drop as you beat them up, alongside some fairly generous one-time bonuses for hitting high kill and combo counts. Basically, you can just accumulate these until you can fling them in a shop, which gives you basic melee and ranged options, as well as special attacks and skins. All of which are pretty useful for changing up your playstyle, though you can only pick them at the start of a run. But really, it's the costumes that really cracked me up here, since beyond the obvious perk of passives and aesthetics, they also dictate the stage music, which is just sort of hilarious really, though at the same time it did start to drive me a bit crazy when I continued to loop through just gradually amping runs with the same tune playing. And speaking of loops, so once you clear a run, you have the option of looping back to the start, only harder, since not only does the beat ramp up and the beat counter vanish, each stage is now loaded with more plentiful and wide-reaching traps and enemies who are more durable, aggressive, as well as elites who shield themselves when they attack, with said attacks being a stage-spanning blade beam. Basically, it's painful if you can't decisively cut them down or shred them with ranged, and makes getting flanked a nightmare. One which I could only endure for so many loops because nothing seemed to be changing. Like yes, the enemies were getting more obnoxious to deal with, but if there was a true ending to be found, it wasn't worth the grind to me, and I guess that's what my final thoughts on the game are. As far as my initial playthroughs went, figuring out the boss patterns and getting progressively further made for a fun time, and there was a certain sense of satisfaction to clear the end for that first time and even fiddle with the loop for a bit. So as far as that goes, I'd even go as far as saying the experience felt like a hit, even with its sometimes wonky localization. That said, as far as its more roguish aspirations, that's where things start to fall apart because your runs will start to blur together quickly. There just aren't enough interesting options to build towards at large, and if you do feel inclined to go so far as to engage with the loops, that only compounds itself further given the elite melee enemies are the biggest change, and they are obnoxious. So suffice to say, it fumbles things on that front. But hey, it's not just roguelites I've been looking to explore in my downtime, so let's switch things up a bit and tackle something different. Specifically, Painted Black Games' horror-fueled adventure, The Long Reach, which provides a surreal story to navigate through a combination of puzzle-solving and light stealth elements. And honestly, I'll definitely admit that it managed to intrigue me on a narrative front, since it kicks things off with an altogether odd cold open that helps to set the stage for the literal insanity that ensues later. Basically, you work at a research facility, and in the midst of an experiment, something goes terribly wrong. Well, not like that, but pretty bad all the same, since the building's now on lockdown with you inside and some very unhinged coworkers. Just a recipe for a grand old time. And in a sense, I do mean that, since I find The Long Reach's overarching plot fairly interesting, replete with all sorts of legitimately unnerving moments. Still, as much as I enjoyed the setting at large, it does have some fairly notable flaws, and that largely rests in the character dialogue. While there are options to choose from, they don't really result in any significant changes, with the most meaningful use of choice being centered around a specific late-game puzzle, which would be relatively fine in isolation were it not for the fact that the character writing in itself can feel a bit weak at times. And I really can't even call this a puzzle, really. It's more of a matter of just slowly brute forcing options until it eventually finishes. Which, you know, it would be relatively fine in isolation, I guess, were it not for the fact that the character writing itself can feel a bit weak at times. Really, it's the main character that's the biggest offender here, given that he's coasting through this cataclysmic scenario, and he spends his time snarking for the bulk of it or mouthing off like a jackass. That's not to say it doesn't get better, but it definitely feels like a defining trait, especially early on. Beyond that, the only other narrative element worth commenting on is that while there is technically two endings, one of them is essentially a game over that just abruptly ends things and is part of a binary choice at the very end of the game. So, yeah. As for the gameplay, well, as far as adventure games go, The Long Reach is a fairly straightforward example for the genre, given the bulk of what you'll be doing is running around the facility picking up items so you can use them in the appropriate place. Which is generally fine, but there are definitely a few puzzles where the item combinations can feel a bit obtuse. The bell puzzle, for instance, stumped me for a bit before I remembered I had another item in my inventory, and just happened to use it because I was like, well, I have nothing else I can do. And that was the solution! And while there were a couple novel puzzles, again, the combination-oriented one is more or less just a gradual process that essentially feels like brute force progression, and the safe combination solution was so obscure that I did wind up just brute forcing it. The temptation was high in the first place because there could only be like 16 combinations. Not that that stopped me before, because I have brute forced combinations that have had hundreds and even thousands of possibilities. So like, Still, the only other notable gameplay element that stuck out to me was the stealth aspect, since you will occasionally come across enemies, and I'll give the game credit here, as baffling as they could be, they provided the most unique encounters in the game. Trying to skulk around doors without triggering a patrolling enemy was tense, or fleeing until I could find an escape. Admittedly, it could be pretty unforgiving, since the enemies are faster than you and kill you instantly, but the encounters are fairly infrequent, so I never really felt like my progress was stuck due to them. And that's about all I have to say about The Long Reach, admittedly. It's a very straightforward experience execution-wise, with a narrative that's interesting conceptually, but which definitely suffers from the quality of its writing here and there. Essentially, the sort of flawed but fun type of experience that originally led me to making Fumbles a rating. So, yeah, if you're a fan of sci-fi elements, horror, and don't mind the gameplay elements aren't the most engaging, and occasionally veer a bit too close into fetch quest territory, well, The Long Reach might be worth a gander. Which brings us to the final title in this episode, High-Bit Studios' 1980X. Which is a bit tricky to describe, partly because it's akin to a compilation composed of several arcade-inspired minigames, but largely because of how central its narrative is and how its delivery interacts with the rest of the experience. Which, okay, yes, getting ahead of myself. So, 1980X follows the kid, who, for reasons the game later expands upon, finds themselves seeking comfort in the arcade scene, both for the sense of community they can find among the misfits it tracks, and the escapism that the game themselves provide. And honestly, it works pretty well since the core ideas the game winds up exploring aren't really rooted in the environment itself, with the setting serving more as a nostalgic look at an early era of gaming, a fun bit of window dressing to the actual theme of the story it's telling. The thing is, the way it's executed is a bit odd, which is to say, if you're coming to this game expecting to be actively engaged in playing it, you might find yourself disappointed. See, 1980X's story plays out over the course of a number of voice-acted cutscenes, which is neat and all, save for the small issue that they make up the bulk of the experience. Because yes, it offers a handful of arcadey-esque games to engage with, but their overall length veers on the shorter side of things. Appetizers in a sense, though some wound up feeling a bit undercooked. Like unsubstantial filler to pick at between the lengthy cutscenes which would play out after each segment. Frankly, it gets to the point that 1980X sometimes feels more like a stylized movie than a game. Still, despite my misgivings on that front, I do have to give it credit. As narrow as those slices of gameplay may be at times, it does still provide a varied experience. The intro, for example, takes the form of a minimalistic brawler, which is certainly a neat idea, save for the fact that the aforementioned simplicity makes it feel more like a proof of concept than a satisfying sliver of gaming. Comparatively, the shoot-'em-up stage actually feels like it would be right at home as the introductory level to an SNES game, since it has a decent range of ideas that it plays around with for the obstacles, the general enemy variety, the boss encounters, and even a few power-ups. And then there's the driving stage, which was more of a mixed bag for me because while there is technically a timer you're racing against in order to reach certain checkpoints, coasting between cars is largely a leisurely experience, and I very rarely had to do anything beyond hold down the throttle or lightly tap a direction key to avoid slamming into a wall. And the very tail end of the experience is more or less the introduction to another cutscene. So I was definitely surprised when I hit the dash and slash game and proceeded to get my teeth kicked in. Which is funny, since I felt powerful at the start given the altogether forgiving health pools as well as the rapid attack, slick dash, and oh so responsive and aimable jump. Like, the tools at your disposal initially feel like overkill, especially since you can then power up your attack's damage and range further by collecting the light orbs scattered throughout the stage. It's a neat little recipe here. There's just one thing. It's not long until it starts to add obstacles ranging from death pits to instant death spike traps, descending ceilings, as well as some nifty enemy arrangements. And given these stages are fairly lengthy and you're constantly on the move, it can make for some fun and twitchy, tense bits of platforming, especially if you got tagged by a hit and lost meter, since you now will need to travel along a certain route to build more. It's admittedly, it can be a bit unforgiving, since, again, there's quite a bit that can punch your ticket admittedly, and these segments feel lengthier due to that precision, but it felt rewarding to get through, and each of the portions do feel pretty distinct from each other. It's, without a doubt, my absolute favorite segment of 1980X, and it's one of those moments where it's neat that the game does include a chapter select element, which will let you pick up a game you really did like, if you happen to want to see if you can get a better score at it, so to speak. That said, that is the one major highlight, because the following segment, the RPG segment, like, I'd like to preface this, it took me longer than I should have, largely because I didn't realize there was a timing minigame for hits, but hot damn did it take me longer, leading to this absolutely agonizing cycle of dying and restarting. It took me way longer than it ever should have for this to dawn on me. Realistically, it probably tacked on at least 10 to 15 minutes of playtime, because once you get the hang of the system, you'll just blitz through the RPG. Because, well, again, it's very minimalistic. You have 3 attacks and all enemies are weak to one of them. Other than that, you have a heal you can use once a fight, and that's about it. Just hug a wall in the dungeon, travel along, time your hits to end the fight in your favor, heal occasionally, and mow down the 3 bosses. That is it. You just trade hits and heal occasionally. So, yeah, by this juncture, you might have a clear idea of why I didn't necessarily find myself engrossed by the gameplay. Like, don't get me wrong, I certainly appreciate 1980X for trying something different, and I did vibe with the story. But quite a bit of the experience was me sitting back in my chair, feet up on my desk, and drinking coffee while waiting to get back to some gameplay, and not being sure if that gameplay is really going to be all that good. So, while the presentation and aesthetic is neat, I can't help but call this game a fumble, and it very nearly veers into fail territory for me. It's only just salvaged by the fact that the highlights for the game were quite good, and it really doesn't overstay its welcome since it's only around an hour in length. But yeah, anyways, that's what I've gone through semi-recently, so I hope you enjoyed this and that it helped to introduce you to new developers and titles. As far as experiments go, this was pretty neat to do, and I hope it made for a fun watch. Also, it was nice that I was able to salvage something from the beats and boss footage I had, because, yeah, that was the one where the audio blew out. Anyways, for those still here, if there's a game you feel really does deserve a full-blown review, leave a comment and hit subscribe. Also, PS, check the description for a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron. You can also find links to my merch house with neat swag like shirts and coffee mugs, as well as my Patreon to see content early and support the channel, like Andy Noted, Shrimp Mania, and Damie. Anywho, catch you folks later!